The goodbye should have felt ordinary. A kiss at the door, a reminder to call when the flight landed, a promise to bring something back from the trip. All the right words were there, spoken in the right order, with the right tone. And yet something underneath felt wrong, too smooth, too settled, as if the moment had already been rehearsed. There was no hesitation in his movements, no lingering pause, no trace of the small anxieties that usually come with separation. Bags were placed neatly by the door, keys laid out in advance, the house unusually tidy. Even the air felt arranged, like a stage set for an ending no one had announced out loud. The hug was brief, polite, the kind reserved for acquaintances, not for someone who had shared years of life, arguments, laughter, plans. His arms loosened too quickly, as if holding on any longer might expose something he was trying to keep hidden. The smile that followed didn't reach his eyes. It stayed fixed on his mouth, careful and controlled. "Travel safe," he said. "Not I'll miss you. Not call me when you land." Just 2 words, clipped and final. At the time, it was easy to explain it away. Stress, work, a rough patch. Marriages go through quiet seasons, after all. But silence has different textures, and this one was heavy with certainty. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of someone who already knew how the story would end. He didn't ask how long the trip would feel. He didn't ask if the schedule was packed. He didn't complain about the days apart. Instead, he nodded, checked the time, and reminded about locking the door behind. As if the house already belonged to someone else. Even the way he stood felt different, slightly angled away. Body already turned back inside, already moving forward without looking back. When the door closed, there was no pause on the other side. No footsteps lingering. Just immediate movement, like a man relieved to finally drop a role he'd been playing. The ride to the airport replayed that moment again and again. The calm, the ease, the unsettling absence of emotion. Somewhere between the traffic lights and the security line, a quiet thought surfaced. This didn't feel like a temporary goodbye. It felt like permission. While the trip unfolded, meetings, emails, long days that ended in exhaustion calls were shorter than usual. Messages were brief, functional, stripped of warmth. Responses came late or not at all. When they did arrive, they felt copied and pasted as if effort itself had become unnecessary. "How's work?" "Busy, talk later." Later never came. Each night, the distance grew heavier. Not because of miles, but because of clarity slowly forming. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. The emotional withdrawal hadn't started with the trip. It had only been disguised until then. Looking back, the signs were everywhere. The way he'd stopped arguing months earlier, choosing silence instead of resolution. The way plans for the future had quietly disappeared from conversation. The way affection became routine, then optional, then absent. None of it happened suddenly. It happened deliberately. This trip wasn't the cause. It was the opportunity. While meetings filled the days, something else was happening back home. A narrative was being finalized. Decisions were being executed. The farewell at the door wasn't a pause in the marriage, it was the closing scene. He knew, his family knew. Only one person was being kept in the dark. The realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with a cold clarity that settled deep in the chest. A sense that the marriage hadn't ended because of distance or conflict, but because it had already been replaced in his mind. The goodbye wasn't strange because he didn't care. It was strange because he was already finished. By the time the return flight landed, the truth had begun to take shape. Whatever waited on the other side of that front door wouldn't be a continuation. It would be confirmation. The goodbye wasn't rushed. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't uncertain. It was final, because the ending had been decided long before the suitcase was packed. The signs were there long before they were recognized for what they truly were. At the time, they blended easily into daily life, disguised as stress, exhaustion, or the ordinary wear that time leaves on relationships. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just small absences that felt inconvenient rather than alarming. Calls began to go unanswered, not missed accidentally, but ignored deliberately. The phone would ring until silence replaced it, followed by a message hours later explaining busyness, meetings, fatigue. Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that only became visible in hindsight. Conversations shortened. Questions that once invited long responses were answered with single words. Stories about the day ended before they began. There was no curiosity, no follow-up, no shared laughter filling the gaps. Silence moved in quietly, settling between sentences, stretching longer each time. Affection changed shape. It didn't disappear immediately, it weakened. Touch became predictable. Hugs felt timed. Kisses replaced without presence, lips meeting skin while the mind remained elsewhere. Intimacy turned into routine, something checked off rather than felt. The warmth was still there, technically, but it no longer reached the heart dot at the time it was easy to justify. Work pressure, family expectations, personal struggles. After all, people withdraw when life becomes heavy. That's what logic insisted. But the truth was far more calculated. He had stopped investing emotionally long before the decision became visible. Emotional distance wasn't a reaction, it was preparation. Plans for the future quietly dissolved. Conversations about upcoming months were redirected or delayed. Anything that required commitment was met with hesitation disguised as practicality. Let's see later. We'll talk about it. Now isn't the right time. The future became a vague concept rather than a shared vision. Arguments disappeared too, which should have been a warning. Disagreements no longer mattered to him. Issues were brushed aside instead of addressed. He no longer fought because he no longer cared about fixing anything. Silence replaced effort, and indifference replaced concern. There was a shift in priorities that felt subtle but sharp. Time once protected for the marriage was suddenly unavailable. Evenings extended longer. Weekends filled up quickly. And when questioned, irritation followed defensiveness that arrived too fast, too strong, as if any curiosity threatened to expose something fragile beneath the surface. His attention moved elsewhere, not just physically, but emotionally. The kind of presence that listens, remembers, and responds was gone. He heard words without absorbing them. He nodded without understanding. He existed in the same space while living entirely outside it. The signs didn't scream betrayal. They whispered abandonment. Every missed call was a brick placed between two lives. Every short conversation widened the gap. Every mechanical gesture drained meaning from what was once genuine. He wasn't pulling away suddenly, he was slowly detaching, piece by piece, so the final break would feel easier for him. What made it cruel was the patience of it all. He allowed the distance to grow gradually, letting doubt settle quietly instead of confronting it honestly. He chose comfort over courage, strategy over truth. And the distance worked. By the time the realization began to form, the emotional connection had already been thinned to a thread. The shock of what came later hurt less because the pain had been distributed over months of quiet neglect. That was the plan. By the time divorce papers appeared, the groundwork had been laid. The coldness no longer felt sudden, it felt familiar. The absence already existed. The paperwork only gave it a name. Looking back, every sign lined up perfectly. The unanswered calls, the rushed conversations, the fading affection. None of it was accidental. Each step was taken carefully, deliberately, to soften the impact of an ending he had already accepted. He prepared himself emotionally while leaving the other side confused. questioning and slowly deprived of connection. He made sure the fall wouldn't hurt him, only the one left standing. Alone in the aftermath. The betrayal wasn't just in the decision to leave. It was in the months spent pretending nothing had changed. And once those signs finally made sense, it became clear that the distance was never about stress at all. It was about making goodbye easier for him. The moment the door opened, something felt wrong, not loud, not obvious, but deeply unsettling. The house was full, yet the air felt rehearsed. Faces turned with expressions already prepared, as if everyone had practiced their roles before this scene began. There was no surprise in their eyes, no confusion, no urgent questions asking what had happened or why things felt tense. Just calm, too much calm. The mother was the first to step forward. Her voice was gentle, overly careful, wrapped in sympathy that felt hollow the moment it landed. She spoke slowly, choosing words the way someone does when they already knows the ending. "It must be a lot to take in," she said, placing a hand lightly on an arm, her touch brief and distant. Not comforting, performative. That was the first crack. If this had truly been sudden, there would have been shock. There would have been concern, maybe even anger. Instead, there was acceptance. Immediate, effortless acceptance. As if the news had only been delayed, not revealed. The sister avoided eye contact, busying herself with cups and plates that didn't need attention. Her movements were smooth, controlled. When she finally spoke, it was with a sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "These things happen," she said softly, like a line memorized long ago. No curiosity, no disbelief. Just closure offered far too quickly. The father sat quietly, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he already understood. He didn't ask what led to this. He didn't ask whether there was hope. His silence wasn't confusion, it was confirmation. And the husband stood there, surrounded by his family, looking almost relieved. That relief was louder than any confession. It became painfully clear that this moment wasn't new to them. They weren't processing it in real time. They were revisiting a decision already discussed, already agreed upon, already accepted. Their calm wasn't compassion, it was familiarity. They knew the script. Every response felt timed. Every phrase felt polished. Sympathy came in neat sentences, delivered without emotion, without mess. No one stumbled over words. No one asked the wrong question. No one reacted out of turn. It was as if everyone had been briefed on how to behave, what to say, and most importantly, what not to say. There were no questions about the trip. No curiosity about what changed. No concern about timing. Because nothing had changed for them. The divorce wasn't a shock, it was a checkpoint. Whispers slipped through the room when they thought no one was listening. Subtle glances passed between them. A raised eyebrow here. A knowing sigh there. Each small gesture revealed what their words tried to hide. They had known this was coming long before the suitcase was packed. Later, when the room thinned and voices lowered, fragments of truth surfaced unintentionally. Comments like, "We just want peace," and "this is probably for the best," floated through the air without context, but with confidence. Confidence only comes from certainty, and certainty only comes from prior knowledge. The most painful realization wasn't the divorce itself. It was the coordination. He didn't make this decision alone. He didn't arrive at it suddenly. He didn't face it without support. He had prepared them. He had shaped their opinions. He had given them a version of events where he was justified and someone else was expendable. And they accepted it. Not reluctantly, not critically, but willingly. Their loyalty wasn't to truth. It was to him. That loyalty revealed itself in their lack of curiosity. When someone is innocent, people ask questions. When someone is wronged, families demand explanations. But when a group has already agreed on who will be sacrificed, there's no need for questions at all. The realization settled slowly, heavy and unmistakable. The family wasn't reacting to loss. They were managing fallout. They weren't surprised because the ending had already been decided. They weren't confused because the narrative had already been written. They weren't grieving because they had already moved on. In that moment, the marriage didn't just end, it was exposed as something that had been quietly dismantled in private conversations, shared glances, and collective silence. The trip wasn't the trigger, it was the excuse. And standing there, surrounded by calm faces and rehearsed sympathy, it became clear that the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was shared. They didn't just know the script, they helped write it. It didn't announce itself all at once. The truth slipped in quietly, through habits that no longer aligned and routines that bent without explanation. The house still looked the same, the schedule still followed familiar patterns, but something else had moved in, something unseen yet undeniably present. Messages appeared at odd hours, then vanished. The phone never left his side anymore, not even in rooms where privacy had never mattered before. Screens were tilted away, notifications silenced, passwords changed without discussion. When questioned casually, answers came too quickly, too smoothly, as if already prepared. There was no irritation, only a practiced calm that suggested rehearsal. Evenings stretched longer. Dinners cooled on the table while excuses piled up. Traffic, meetings, last-minute obligations. Weekends that once belonged to the marriage were suddenly unavailable, booked solid with vague commitments that couldn't be questioned without triggering defensiveness. When asked where the time was going, he shrugged, smiled thinly, and redirected the conversation. Clothes carried unfamiliar traces scents that didn't belong to the home. Not strong enough to accuse, but distinct enough to unsettle. Laundry folded differently. Shirts worn once were suddenly washed separately. Small details that meant nothing alone, but together formed a picture too precise to ignore. Late nights became routine. The sound of a car pulling in long after midnight no longer caused surprise, only a quiet awareness. He moved through the house carefully then, lights kept low, steps measured, as if afraid of being seen by someone who already sensed the truth. When spoken to, his voice dropped, gentle and distant, like someone speaking from another room. There was laughter too, but not shared. It surfaced in half smiles at glowing screens, in private moments quickly hidden when footsteps approached. The warmth once reserved for the marriage had found a new direction. It showed in the way his shoulders relaxed while reading messages, in the way his eyes softened at words never meant to be shared openly. The divorce no longer felt like an ending, it felt like a transition, already underway. The realization arrived slowly, carrying more clarity than pain. This wasn't about unresolved conflict or growing apart. There were no explosive arguments, no dramatic turning point. The marriage hadn't failed, it had been replaced. Someone else had been woven into the fabric of his life long before the paperwork appeared. A presence that didn't disrupt his routine, but reshaped it quietly. A person who fit into the hours he created by pulling away elsewhere. A future he rehearsed, while still living in the present. What hurt most wasn't the existence of another woman, it was the planning. The patience. The intention. He didn't stumble into betrayal. He built it carefully, brick by brick, while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. He smiled at breakfast, asked polite questions, shared space all while preparing to step into a life that had already begun without consent or knowledge. The signs became undeniable when the family's behavior aligned too perfectly with his. Their calm made sense now. Their lack of surprise felt justified. They weren't responding to a sudden change, they were welcoming a transition they had already accepted. The replacement wasn't new to them. The divorce wasn't unexpected. The ending wasn't abrupt. It had been managed. Every altered routine now carried meaning. Every unexplained absence fit neatly into a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. The marriage had become a placeholder, a temporary arrangement maintained until the timing felt right to exit. And timing mattered. The office trip wasn't coincidence, it was opportunity. Distance provided cover. Silence created space. While one life paused briefly, another moved forward confidently. The return wasn't meant to restore anything. It was meant to formalize what had already shifted. The discovery didn't come with screams or tears. It arrived with a calm understanding that settled deep and steady. There was nothing left to fight for, because the fight had ended long before awareness began. He hadn't left for someone else after deciding to divorce. He divorced because someone else was already waiting. The old life wasn't broken, it was abandoned mid-performance. The role discarded once the replacement was secure. And the most unsettling part was how effortlessly he moved between the two, believing that overlap would never be noticed. But overlap leaves evidence. Transitions leave gaps. And secrets never stay contained forever. What he called a fresh start was built on deception, supported by silence, and protected by those who chose convenience over truth. And in the quiet space where clarity finally replaced doubt, one thing became undeniable. The marriage didn't end when the divorce was announced. It ended the moment another woman stepped into the future that was never meant to be shared. Silence arrived not as surrender, but as clarity. After everything uncovered, the rehearsed goodbyes, the prepared family, the replacement waiting patiently in the shadows, there was no need for confrontation. Words would only give him something to twist, deny, or weaponize. Rage would satisfy him. Questions would empower him. Silence took all of that away. Observation replaced reaction. Every movement suddenly mattered. The way he checked his phone before speaking. The way his stories shifted depending on the audience. The way dates changed, times overlapped, and excuses contradicted one another without him noticing. Lies, when left uninterrupted, tend to multiply and multiply poorly. Silence gave space to watch. He assumed the calm meant defeat. He mistook stillness for weakness. He moved more freely, carelessly, even believing the danger had passed. And that was when everything became visible. Messages weren't erased as thoroughly. Receipts stayed in pockets. Calls were taken too close, voices too familiar. He reused lies without remembering who he'd told them to. The story fractured at the edges, and silence allowed every crack to show. There was no need to accuse when proof presented itself willingly. His family continued their performance, but even they grew sloppy. Sympathy turned into impatience. Reassurance slipped into control. Comments revealed more than they intended, hints of conversations that happened long before the truth was meant to surface. Their confidence betrayed them. People who believe they are untouchable always reveal too much. Silence kept them talking. Each inconsistency became a thread. Each thread led to something deeper. A timeline formed naturally, no force required. What he said last week didn't match what he claimed today. What he denied contradicted what his family implied. What he promised one person conflicted with what he offered another. Truth doesn't need to be chased. It surfaces when lies get comfortable. There were moments when anger surged, when the weight of betrayal pressed hard against the chest. But anger was never allowed to speak. It was folded inward, refined, sharpened into focus. Silence wasn't numbness. It was discipline. And discipline reveals everything. He began justifying himself without being asked. Explaining details no one questioned. Defending actions that hadn't been challenged. Guilt filled the quiet he expected to control. Silence became a mirror he couldn't avoid, reflecting back every decision he tried to escape. He thought silence meant forgiveness. He thought it meant exhaustion. He thought it meant the past no longer mattered. He was wrong. Silence meant records were being kept. Silence meant patterns were being mapped. Silence meant the truth was being assembled patiently, piece by piece. The strongest moment wasn't discovering the betrayal. It was realizing there was no rush, no urgency, no need to win an argument or force an apology. Everything he built was unstable by design. All it needed was time, and time favors truth. The more he relaxed, the more exposed he became. He underestimated stillness, underestimated patience, underestimated how devastating calm observation could be to someone surviving on manipulation. Revenge didn't need drama, it needed accuracy. By the time he sensed something shifting, it was already too late. The narrative he controlled had slipped from his hands. Evidence existed independent of emotion. The story no longer required belief, it required acknowledgement. Silence had done its work, and when the truth finally stood complete, undeniable, and intact, there was no satisfaction in watching him scramble, no pleasure in his panic, just confirmation. Because the greatest revenge wasn't destruction, it was inevitability. And inevitability had been quietly waiting, listening, watching, remembering while he talked himself into his own collapse. Ch. The collapse didn't arrive with thunder. It came quietly, the way truth always does when lies grow careless. What was meant to remain hidden began surfacing on its own, slipping through cracks created by overconfidence and impatience. The plan depended on control of people, of stories, of timing. And control was the first thing to shatter. It started with a single inconsistency spoken aloud in front of the wrong person. A date that didn't align, a reason that didn't fit. Someone noticed, someone remembered. And once doubt entered the room, it refused to leave. Messages resurfaced that were supposed to be erased. Screenshots existed where denials had been issued. Receipts contradicted carefully rehearsed explanations. What once seemed airtight began leaking from every side. Lies, when stacked too high, collapsed under their own weight. The family fractured next. The same people who once stood united, confident in their shared silence, began protecting themselves. Support turned conditional. Sympathy turned strategic. Accusations emerged in hushed voices, then louder ones. Number. One wanted to be the last one holding the lie when it finally broke. Blame traveled fast. The mother's certainty dissolved into defensiveness. She insisted she'd only known part of the truth. The sister denied involvement, claiming ignorance where approval once lived. The father withdrew entirely, refusing to be associated with a mess that threatened reputation more than conscience. Loyalty proved temporary, and at the center of it all stood the man who believed he had orchestrated everything perfectly. The man who believed distance and silence would protect him. The man who assumed everyone would continue playing their roles once the ending was announced. But when truth surfaced, the script meant nothing. The new life he prepared so carefully began unraveling just as quickly. Promises made to another woman collided with evidence she could no longer ignore. She asked questions, demanded clarity, and when answers failed to align, trust evaporated. What began as excitement turned into suspicion. What felt like escape became entrapment. Suddenly, explanations were needed everywhere. At work, whispers grew louder. People noticed the pattern of behavior, the overlap of timelines, the contradictions told too often to different audiences. Confidence faded. Authority weakened. The image he relied on cracked under scrutiny. The fallout didn't require confrontation. It unfolded naturally, consequence following action without intervention. Watching it happen brought no rush of victory. No celebration, just a steady sense of release. The weight carried for months lifted quietly, replaced by something far more powerful than revenge dash clarity dot. Everything he built depended on silence and belief. Once belief disappeared, silence became meaningless. Each lie unraveled another connection. Each exposure weakened another alliance. People distanced themselves not out of morality, but self-preservation. No one wanted to be associated with a story that had turned toxic. The irony settled in slowly. The plan was meant to remove one person cleanly, efficiently, without resistance. Instead, it dismantled the very foundation it relied on. The marriage he abandoned became the least of his losses. Trust, respect, reputation, those vanished next. And in the middle of the chaos he created, there was stillness. No scrambling, no defending, no explaining. Walking away didn't require permission. It didn't require forgiveness. It didn't require acknowledgement from anyone involved in the betrayal. It required only the decision to stop carrying what never belonged there in the first place. Strength didn't come from winning. It came from refusing to stay entangled. The collapse reached its final stage when excuses ran out, when no one remained to shield him, when every version of the story failed to survive comparison with facts. The life built on betrayal couldn't sustain itself without deception, and deception demands constant maintenance. Exhaustion took over, and when everything finally fell apart, relationships severed, support withdrawn, narratives exposed, there was nothing left to fight against. No need to look back. No need to explain. The plan collapsed because it was never built on truth, and walking away didn't feel like escape. It felt like freedom. If the story stayed with you, if the truth unfolding felt painfully real, take a moment to like this video. It helps these stories reach others who need them. And don't forget to subscribe for more episodes where silence speaks louder than lies. And karma never arrives late. Stay connected. The next truth is already waiting.